So we're actually missing one of the speakers. Okay, then let's wait a bit. It's such a change in a space, so it's going to be kind of tough for us to beat up the previous panel, but we're actually talking a lot about the empathy and expression of that and restlessness through the dance floor. So I think the topic will hopefully towards the end of the night unite us, yeah. But meanwhile, we're waiting for Roger from Jazar Crew, so hold on, yeah. Actually, interesting question. How many people here goes out or parties or go to clubs or? Okay. So it's okay. No, because it's good to know. Sometimes when you speak about clubbing, a lot of people get very confused with certain terms or like what's going on there. So just to understand how to adjust the language, yeah. So are we waiting for Roger or what do you think? Yeah. Just there. Okay. Okay, so we start. So my name is Bogomir Doringer, and I'm active as an artist, researcher, curator, quite actually mix of things, and very often I'm actually networking for myself and for the others, because doing art became quite a bureaucratic process and you always have to convince somebody in something. So yeah, let's say I'm an artist who is interested in researching different social phenomena and the way that they manifested themselves on bodies and in bodies or through bodies of people. So yeah, I'm very grateful to be here tonight and to introduce you to the research that actually also connected me with each of the speakers, panelists here today. So I would like to introduce you the term dance of urgency and how this term was created. So everything started from the project called I Dance Alone, and the project I Dance Alone started with me experiencing something like this. So 1999 in Belgrade, where I was born, NATO bombing took place. And at that time, I discovered a techno club called Industria. So basically, instead of going to basements, we would gather in a techno club and sort of try to beat up the irritation of the political injustice. Because in a way, me and my group of friends, we were very much against Milosevic regime. Still, even though this collective body, this protest body was very big, we were still bombed by NATO in 1999. So in a way to mock the possible death, but also to protest, we actually would gather in clubs and dance. So for me, understanding of dancing was quite different in a way. I kind of understood dance as I said, the protest. So when I moved to Netherlands in 2004, I got shocked with zero urgency that was expressed on a dance floor, and also how bodies were not expressing, somehow moving much. So I became obsessed with the idea to try to document different dance floors by observing them from a bird's eye view. So to apply this kind of divine perspective or watching from above and look into the dynamics and what they're expressing. So what's the intention of the choreography, the gestures, the distances between bodies? Are there girls, are there boys? Do bodies look into the DJ or not? But also, what are the conditions in which these people gather? So in which they kind of enter, let's say, altered state of consciousness and participate into something. There is this sort of collective dance. So this is how I Dance Alone started. And what I thought is that by watching these crowds, you could actually understand in what kind of social-political environment these parties are taking place, but also that you might be able to sort of predict certain urgency coming or certain social-political changes coming. So, you know, just like when you watch clouds, you kind of think like, okay, it's gonna rain. So I think that more expressive crowds are, the more social-political urgency is there. So I started, of course, like moving from Amsterdam and looking for places where I felt comfortable or where the dance that I remember is resonating. So that brought me to, yes, like the dance by function, you know, it's a nonverbal communication expressed from an individual towards the others. It can be, you can dance alone or together. That's also the question that we are raising here tonight. So are we dancing alone or together? So by function, yes, it can be social, ceremonial, erotic, sacred, liturgical, competitive, martial, and what's missing, political. So even though, you know, like dances that we have on this screen from 60s till like 90s, somehow we're always introduced in a socio-political context. Or let's say voguing as a kind of reclaiming of a space that, let's say, African-American community did not have in New York, etc. So in Zimbabwe and in South Africa, there was a dance called Toy dance, which is actually that without a weapon you can unite in a kind of collective body, and that body becomes threatening to the system. So this dance got forbidden at the beginning of 2000 because of its political connotation. So music and resistance is something that is very known. It has been always there, but somehow we need to remind ourselves. And unfortunately, we remind ourselves in times of crisis. So, which maybe is, it should somehow maybe happen a bit earlier. So I would like you to, also the music and resistance was very much introduced to me through underground resistance, so the collective from Detroit, and a group of DJs who were very important in uniting in Eastern and Western Berlin, and I will explain a little bit why. But also, they, particularly for the term, for the topic Dance of Urgency, created a video essay that shows how the music was always part of the resistance for black community in States. So I would like you to hear a little bit of samples. So there is a music that goes with the visuals, an archive of visuals showing the position of African Americans but also like through the slavery basically. And what's also interesting, the work is basically made by Mark Flash and Cornelius Harris from Underground Resistance. So we will now have a little bit of sound. So they were interested in the history of African drum and how it sort of attached itself through the different music instruments, and then now to the bass that we will be dancing later here in BOZAR as well. But what's important, like I met Dimitri Hegeman, the founder of a club Trésor, and he thought it's very important and interesting to mention that in order for uniting after the fall of wall, the East and West, Berlin, the repetitive beats and non-verbal music was important. So underground resistance was playing a lot in Berlin. And most of the clubs happen always in abandoned industrial ruins that somehow through the participation and the ritual of dancing start becoming cultural institutions. And in the same way, Club Bassiani, that we will be talking here today with the founders of the club, was built basically under the football stadium in Tbilisi in Georgia, so in an old pool that is not being used anymore, so but it has this kind of collective memory. And again, what will be discussed later is that this club is very much fighting for the visibility of those who do not feel comfortable uncomfortable in society or who do not have a space, but also for uniting a very diverse group of people, so through the dance. So if you think that they're trying to unite as well LGBTQ community, actually it's in a G-spot of a football stadium, so in a place where the hooligans are screaming loud, they're actually dancing even louder in the underground of this space. The club is particularly interesting because it changed the visibility of the Georgia and youth, and it kind of reconstructed, redesigned also how we know Tbilisi. And last year in May, Georgians for 2 days danced in front of the parliament, and this became into like broadcasted image internationally that gave goosebumps to many of us, but also it reminded us on the combination of a politics and the dance floor. So just 1 week later, in Berlin, the Reclaim Club Culture, so the unity of clubs and music festivals, organized anti-fascist protest that gathered 85,000 people. So the exotic dance from far away, that to Europe was somehow always something that happens in other countries, is now an urgency that is happening in Europe. And I think the event that we are participating here is also recognizing that, and that's an urgency that the youth needs to sort of be reshaped, re-educated, and united through different mediums. So I just found out that Mamba Negra collective from Sao Paulo is also here tonight. Unfortunately, I didn't know that before. So it's interesting to mention Mamba Negra because the participation in Sao Paulo in clubs, for example, like if you go to Techno Club The Edge, you need to give your fingerprints. So it's not really for everybody. So what happened with Mamba Negra, it's a collective of different artists, performance artists, musicians. They started using spaces that nobody wanted in a downtown of Sao Paulo and creating these massive raves that gave a different kind of visibility to this youth, but it also empowered them. So just to mention some more, Cxema in Ukraine, AFZ in Leipzig, Mamba Negra, Mina in Portugal, Njege Njege. So what we are here discussing tonight is basically, or not discussing at the moment, I'm introducing it, but we will be discussing it, is exactly that there is a certain movement going on, so the return of politics and dance to the dance floor. So the term dance of urgency is a dance that arises from the emotions that occur in times of personal and collective crisis. And such a dance empowers individual and collectives, and what I would also argue, it's not a constant, so it's a dance that comes and goes. And this is the term that is being born basically from that observation from a bird's eye view, and that through a lot of gatherings in which we participated, symposium is sort of now finally offered to audience as well. What's also new, what came out of the project, is the space of urgency. So the dance of urgency can be a signal of a community or a crowd that demands a space but wants maybe to exit out of the closed space into the streets. So they somehow go next to each other. The space is being defined by the dance, and in order the dance happens, sometimes you need a space. So Space of Urgency is now the research project that, together with the University of Applied Arts Social Design Department in Vienna, and Liz Kingma, Arno Bosma, and Lucas Counter is starting. It's a collaboration between Amsterdam, Berlin, and Vienna in thinking what's the free space. So I don't know how you feel when you walk through the cities. Do you feel like you're choreographed by what you consume? And that maybe sometimes you actually feel that there is nothing else to do in a city if you're not able to consume. So it really depends from city to city, but it's also this idea of something for free, which, for example, when you mention in Netherlands, there's always this awkward look that people think that something for free is not something that should be taken serious. So it's sort of interesting how this concept of free spaces is totally sort of pushed out of the image of what the city should be and look like. So that was like a short introduction of 10 minutes and some ideas that came out of the research. So I will introduce each the speaker now briefly, and then we will go through questions and hopefully engage also with you. So Dr. Kelina Gottman from King's College is actually a writer of the book Choromania, Dance and Disorder, and I took a short description of the book. So when political protest is read as an epidemic madness, religious ecstasy as nervous disease, and angular dance moves as dark as uncouth, the disorder being described is choromania. So I'm sure some of you heard about a choromania, but probably described maybe differently. So Kilina, I would like to ask you if you could shortly introduce your practice and the term choromania. Yeah, welcome.
Thank you so much, Bogomir. It's just really an honor to be here, to be in conversation with you and with everyone here as well. I came to this work from the dance floor and also from the archive. And what I was interested in initially, this project was many years in formation, was what I thought at the outset quite simply as being a sort of history of cross-world, transnational, trans-historical. At all times and places there have been dance manias. There have been sort of times when people have gathered and risen, and there have been raves, and there have been bacchanals, and I thought, how wonderful, I'm going to trace this. It's too big, but I will. And initially, with my research, I discovered that I had a kind of quite annoying preponderance of materials that were coming from the 19th century. A lot of them were coming from medical literature. And so what I started to unravel was the way in which there was a very particular moment in the 19th century when all sorts of histories of movement, of crowd movements, of political revolt, of different sorts of bodily disjunctions were described with this notion of the dancing disease. So a disorder of dancing, an epidemic madness. St. Vitus's dance was the sort of paradigmatic case. Some of you might have heard this, St. Vitus dance is a kind of, is it a nervous disorder? And so what I became interested in was how this notion of an epidemic disease that arises at times of stress was really gaining prominence during an important moment in the formation of nation states. So in the 19th century, a lot of new scientific disciplines were arriving, a lot of colonialism was spreading throughout the world, and as colonial medicine, for example, started to go around and say, here we are in Madagascar, and there's a revolt, which if you read the archives actually is an anti-government revolt. This was being described in the terms of a medical disorder, of an epidemic of madness, of mad dancing. So I became very interested in this notion of a dancing disease, which to me, as a person who engages in dancing, thought was quite extraordinary. And I discovered how prominent it is, and still in medical journals now, in journals of neurology, of historical neurology, there's still a kind of widely understood consensus that, back then in the 14th century, after the plague, people started taking to the streets and dancing, and they had some sort of a nervous disorder, and now you can see remnants of this in what's called chorea minor, which is a neuromotor disorder that involves often a sort of difficulty controlling the limbs. So there was at this crucial moment of the formation of what we can understand as sort of colonial scientific modernity, a conglomeration or a conjunction of these, what were understood in the early science of neurology as neuromotor disorders, and all of these fetes, parties, protests, all understood as being on a continuum. And this narrative continues still in medical literature, but also in popular journalism. So there are often cases you might hear in the news of, for example, some young women who are hysterical, who are all, frothing and falling and raving, and they're having this kind of contagious, so the notion of a kind of contagious emotion that would involve bodily spasms continues to be pinned to what was essentially a 14th century supposedly dancing disease. So for me, this was really an important set of observations. I spent a lot of time reading old medical journals, old journals of very early sociology and anthropology, and other things to try to understand what was the fantasy, what was this fantasy that there would be a sort of body in disarray. And so I described this as choreomania, but as a way also to reclaim choreomania. So the language of choreomania, of the dancing disease, what was being used in this material as a sort of often very black, often feminine, irrational, animal, all of this sort of underbelly of everything that was not the sort of efficient, work, straight kind of form of movement. And so this way to sort of understand choreomania as being simultaneously a kind of designation of a disorder, but also something that can be understood as describing all of these forms of normativity of individual and collective bodies is what I became interested in thinking in terms of choreomania. So the work, I think, has a lot of repercussions, a lot of ways for helping us to understand some of what is going on in some of the images that you were showing, some of what was going on with Bassiani, for example, a long history of not only movements of bodies, people gathering together and dancing and uprising, but also a whole political language and a whole political scientific language that sees this as a form of disorder in every sense, as a kind of a contagious epidemic that has to be governed and contained. So I could say just a little bit more now about this, or I can sort of save a few thoughts. Yeah. I mean, this is basically the historical material, so the point of view that I'm coming from with this. I think that there are a number of things that come out of this in terms of questions, which include, for example, what does it mean if we understand that there's a sort of resistance that is so pervasive to the appearance in public space of a body in disarray? What does that make us understand, or how does that enable us better to understand how our bodies are continuously being sort of reinforced into certain rhythms, certain spaces within which, and certain manners within which we move? So what I was reading, for example, with early 20th century dance manuals, a lot of instruction against moving in ways that are too jagged or irregular. So irregular movement that has, so the whole notion of excess is something that gets deployed, that gets often medicalized. So it becomes interesting to think, how do we then understand better a body in revolt? How do we understand these uprisings as being a kind of, literally an expression, so a sort of an out-pressing of a whole set of anger, frustration. Some of the cases that I was reading, when I say cases, I was tracing a genealogy. So I was interested in seeing how the idea of the dancing mania moved along, rather than trying to catalog. And I was interested in how certain texts would get repeated and transferred. And so somebody read this and then they said, ooh, this is a dancing mania. And actually you look at it and it's the Sioux, the Native American uprising in the 1890s against the government. US government was cutting rations, basically starving all of the indigenous population. This was the real height of the genocide. And they were dancing, and this was military intervention was brought in, and if you look in Madagascar, there was a revolt against the pro-European king. So there are all sorts of ways in which these dances of revolt, these uprisings into public space, were then understood or sort of dismissed as medical problems of epidemiology, and problems of epidemiology that had a strange sort of recurrence at the same time, a very like titillating, phantasmatic recurrence of a bacchanalian, a sort of medieval bacchanalianism. So this is one of the terms that I look at. There's a way in which it's sort of a Bacchic resurgence, and that is everything against which civilization, the civilization of order and control, is meant to be working. I think this helps us understand some of the language of resistance to resistance. And I think I'll sort of leave it at that, and I'm happy to come back to some of these questions.
I think this is a very interesting introduction into what Nadia Orashvili and Georgi Kikonishvili from Bassiani did, but also, I mean, now we could reformulate that actually you spread a kind of contagious choreography that possessed bodies of people and resulted into the revolution in front of the parliament. So it's interesting because the language that has been used by you in media very much actually reminds on what Kalina was just saying. So yes, Nadia Rashvili, Georgo Kiknashvili from Bassiani, and I would like to introduce them through... sorry, you were not able to see this before. Oh, I'm so sorry. Okay. So, yeah, let's just read shortly again the definition of choromania, or the description of the choromania by Kalina. Okay. And so now I would like to introduce you. So Nadia and Georgi worked on a short film called Dance or Die that was somehow a result of ongoing relationship between us, and even before the revolution, because simply that place resonates in a very different way. So Dance or Die is a kind of a video essay that describes of why Bassiani was created and how, what are the references, and we're going to show just a short part. So I don't think that you're able to actually read subtitles, so Georgi will just read loud from his phone while the images are being played. Yeah.
ჩვენ თავისუფალი საქართველოს მოქალაქე.
We are the citizens of independent Georgia, free generation, much hated by the violent institutions. Outcasted for freedom, youngsters, women and men, escaped from violence, rich and poor, dreamers lost on the way to seeking of happiness. We are the rejected children of our country, understanding of whom was hard for society, who declared freedom as treat. Thus we decided, if no one listens to us, let's listen to each other, dance for each other and for each other's gods. We compromised day for peace and occupied city by the night. When other citizens, tired of wars, work and indifference, we are sleeping deep. This is how Bassiani was born, disobedient, uncompromising warrior with an angry gaze to injustice. The name is of a historic war won by Queen Tamar centuries ago. The helmet symbolically depicts the union of East and West, just as Georgian culture. Time to end the warfare, we hold the weaponizing solidarity.
So that's actually one part in the film which I thought it's really interesting. And as I said, like the Club Bassiani is under the football stadium in Georgia, so somehow it's a clash of, let's say, groups that somehow maybe dislike each other, but through the dance floor started uniting. So I would then like to introduce Roger Clay from Jazar Crew. So Roger, welcome. Could you like briefly introduce what is Jazar Crew, who are the members, how many of you, and what is the aim of Jazar Crew, basically? Yeah.
Yeah. Hello. My name is Roger. I'm from Jazar Crew from Palestine. Jazar Crew is a collective made from 4 or 5 people, some active, some not. We are organizing parties, DJs, and more than parties, organizing events, some cultural events, like a film festival, running a venue, and things like this. We started around 9 years ago, and organizing parties in Haifa, and then we started to organize parties in the other side of Palestine, in the West Bank, and created like a bridge between the prohibited areas from the other side, and from the parties actually happens there like community, and people got to know each other and started to create more projects and dance together, because we as a Palestinian, we are separated there is a Palestinian in the occupied territory, there's Palestinian in Gaza, in the West Bank, and in the diaspora. And from the parties, we actually connected and we met the other Palestinians in the dance floor. And
yeah, sorry, we're just watching here actually a Boiler Room Palestine that was filmed in Ramallah. And this was a big thing because actually, if I'm correct, like Nicolas Jarre was one of the first musicians who came to play to Ramallah. And then very fast after that, well, not actually very fast, a year later, basically, Boiler Room decided to give the visibility to the scene and to the Jazar Crew.
Nicolas Jarre, one of the biggest electronic musicians, came, but other than Nicolas Jarre, many came in the back in the times, and some maybe not big as Nicolas Jarre. But Nicolas Jarre was one of the big ones who came to Haifa, Ramallah, and in Jordan and Amman.
So just to elaborate, like, why is it important to actually have somebody like, I mean, Boiler Room or musicians coming to Ramallah and playing, like, just to understand what is...
The people, the microphone is, like the people in Ramallah, they are limited with going out. They need a permission or a visa to travel. And every time they need to go outside of the West Bank, they need to apply, as I said, for a visa. And it's important for artists to go there because people there appreciate the music and like to dance and like the music. And
okay, so in a way you're defending a certain space or reclaiming the space through the dance and participation. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so yeah, so that's actually maybe a good introduction to, let's say, like Nadia. We haven't heard you still. So Nadia actually will have a simultaneous, so we'll have a translation by Georgi. She prefers to speak in Georgian. So when we met, and first of all, when I experienced the club, because I didn't really trust the media presentation, you know, like there are all these hypes and like, yeah, there's this cool place, there's that cool place. So I really wanted to experience Bassiani. And when I realized that it really feels different, I started talking to Nadia and Georgi. And I was fascinated how they created a dance floor where the choreographies are choreographed in a very different way than I'm familiar with in Western Europe or even what I remember. But somehow it did remind on the end of 90s in Belgrade. And what was also important there is that you had a very big set of strategies and art that was used in communication and visual identity of the club. So since we didn't see that part of the club, like I would like to know, like what are the references that you took from a Georgian culture, from the ancient culture, and how that actually shaped itself into Bassiani. Because what I also understood is that Bassiani is almost like an entity, it's almost like an art concept in which people perceive certain ideas, but through the dance, first of all. So, yeah, could you please introduce us to the strategies that you applied? Welcome.
დღეს 5 წელი შევსრულებ ბასიანს და კარგი არ მაქვს და ამაზე ვსაუბრობთ.
Today is a 5 years anniversary of Bassiani, so it's really good to speak about this today.
Happy birthday.
Thank you.
ის საკომუნიკაციო ენა, რასაც ვიყენებდით ბასიანის შემთხვევაში, იყო იმისთვის, რომ ჩვენ ეს სივრცე გამოგვეყენებინა, რომ ეს ადამიანები, რომლებიც დადიოდნენ ერთი იდეის გარშემო გაგვეერთიანებინა და დაგვიწყო ბრძოლა იმ უთანასწორობის წინააღმდეგ, რომელიც ქვეყანაში არსებობდა. პრინციპში, ჩემთვის ბასიანი ერთი დიდი სოციალური მოძრაობა არის, რომ სადაც ხო კვირაში ორჯერ ვცეკვავ და დანარჩენი დღეები ერთმანეთს უზიარეთ იდეებს და ვცდილობთ იმ არსებული გამოწვევების დაძლებას, რომელიც ჩვენს ქვეყანაში არსებობს.
The communication language which we used on Bassiani during the communicating with the people was the main thing which was used for uniting the people, the dancers around all these challenges which we had, and to unite these people around the ideas which we shared together, the idea of equality and solidarity. And we are dancing there for 2 days per week, and the rest 5 days we spend this time for sharing the ideas with each other, the ideas which came to us on the dance floor.
და რა თქმა უნდა ეს იქნებოდა ნებისმიერი ვიდეო არტები, პოსტერები, თვალსაჩინო ყველაფერი მიუთითებდა იმისკენ თუ საით მივდიოდით და სახელიც ხო არის ერთ-ერთი ყველაზე დიდი ბრძოლის სახელი. ამიტომ ის ენა ის საკომუნიკაციო ენა იყო ზუსტი, რომელსაც აქამდე მოგვიყვანა, რამაც მოგვიყვანა რევოლუციამდე.
So everything which we used during the communication, the video art, the posters, everything was created for showing the way where Bassiani was headed to and the direction. And the name itself, Bassiani, it's a name of the war. So this communication language and everything was showing what Bassiani was created for. And this is actually what led us to the revolution.
There is one more interesting thing, because if we look like even here in BOZAR in a toilet, you kind of have a written instruction of what is not allowed or tolerated. So, or like even if we would look like in the Reclaim Club culture strategies, they would say there is no dance floor for Nazis. But in your case, actually, the way you were choreographing the dance was that actually exactly the mix of the differences is something that should space like they were actually uniting those who are in conflict rather than separating the spaces. And I think that's quite different than what's happening at the moment and how the clubs are being curated in the Western Europe. And I just would like to ask why this more risky strategies was applied, so that you would have a hooligan next to the transgender person rather than separate them.
მიუხედავად იმისა, რომ ჩვენს ქვეყანას, ჩვენს ქალაქებს უფრო მეტი გამოწვევა აქვთ ჰომოფობიის, ქალთა ჩაგურის და სხვადასხვა უთანასწორობის მიხედვით, ჩვენ არასდროს არ გვითხოვს, რომ ეს სივრცე იქნება დახურული ვინმესთვის, მიუხედავად იმისა, რომ ეს იყო ძალიან დიდი სარისკო ნაბიჯი, რადგან ჩვენ ვიღებდით პასუხისმგებლობას, რომ ეს იქნებოდა თავისუფალი და უსაფრთხო სივრცე იმ მარგინალიზებული ჯგუფებისთვის, რომლებიც საზოგადოებისგან გარიყულები არიან. რა თქმა უნდა, ეს იყო სარისკო, მაგრამ ზუსტადაც რომ ეს იყო ის რწმენა და ის რწმენა, რომ საწარმოიდან შეუძლია გაერთიანოს სხვადასხვა ღირებულებები, სხვადასხვა სოციალური ჯგუფები და ამეგობროს და ისინი ერთიან იდეებისა და ღირებულებების გარშემო გაერთიანოს შემდეგ.
Notwithstanding the fact that there is a very high rate of homophobia and the conservatism and the violence against women in Georgia, notwithstanding this fact, we decided that our club should not be closed for people. So we wanted to let the people of different views in. Of course, it was a very risky step, but we trusted in the power of dance and in the power of dance floor, and we trusted in the idea that if we let the people of different kind of people, the hooligans, the transgender people, and so on, and if these people started dancing together on the same floor, this would unite them, and this would unite them with this solidarity with each other. So that's why we took this risky step to achieve this unity.
და ამან მოიტანა ზუსტად ის, რომ ის ხულიგანები, რომლებიც დამეგობრდნენ სხვადასხვა სოციალურ ჯგუფებთან, დადგნენ სათავეში დადგენ იმ წინააღმდეგობრივი აქციების იქნება, რომელიც იქნება ანტიჰომოფობიური თუ ნარკოპოლიტიკის, ანუ სხვა ჯგუფები გაერთიანდნენ და დაიწყეს ერთმანეთის პრობლემებისთვის აღმოსაფხვრელ ბრძოლა. ეს მოიტანა საციკო მოედანმა, რაც არ მოუტანია სხვა არაფერს მანამდე ჩვენს ქვეყანაში.
And the outcome of it is that these hooligans, the transgender people, the women, the men, all these people united and they started to fight for each other's rights. So if there is a women's march, all these people are standing on the women's march. If there is an action against homophobia, all these people are standing against homophobia. If there is an action for liberating the drug policy, all these people are standing together. And this is what our dance floor brought to us, and this is what nothing in Georgia, nothing else brought such kind of unity to us.
Kalina, I would like to ask you, like, okay, so what we have, I mean, this topic always sounds a little bit like a science fiction because, you know, you go in a semi-state of trance and you dance with people and suddenly you come somehow transformed. So on the other side, what we are talking here is that the choreography can be understood in a broader sense as a right to actually move. So if one has a club to go, it's already achievement. If one has a street to walk through. So maybe this idea of a choreography and dance as not just dancing in a club, but just sort of like, if you could like elaborate on this demand for freedom and the freedom of movement actually.
Yeah, thank you. I've become really interested through this in thinking the freedom of movement as being not just, that movement is not in itself a good, but the possibility of movement is what allows constantly for transformation. So one may wish to be still and one may be very powerfully still, and that might be what is the most resistant or sort of grounding act in that moment. But to be able to have these, what I think of as zones of intensity or choreo zones, or these sort of areas of gathering, that isn't in itself what creates the transformation, but there is, as you were just suggesting, a kind of moment or a movement towards that place, or something that might be very much underlying. So for example, what I was seeing with these notions in Madagascar or in the American Plains, for example, or some of the other cases that I was looking at, I mean, when I say cases, some of these narratives, so much of the time actually, and it's the same thing what you're describing, I mean, you know, every place of gathering of bodies in revolt is going to be a different one, but there's going to be a whole sets of histories and grievances that we are always in motion, that are going to be what can surface, and in a place of one could say a kind of a safety, or a kind of a place of a refuge. And so, and this is a little bit the question I think often we talk about an underground or under commons, and it isn't necessarily that there is a literal being underground, although that burrowing can be something of a sort of place in which there's an allowing of that shifting to happen. But I think that if we understand this as a sort of capacity for, or as an intensification of what is there, and an intensification that happens, you know, physically, corporeally, but also in those synchronizations or those rhythmicities, and in that kind of visibilization, that sort of seeing oneself with others within a space together, then what that does is it allows for, in the present moment, not just seeing the possibility of some other future, but actually being within that moment in a very charged way. So I think that this has huge implications for how we understand all sorts of notions of freedom of movement, or you know, we tend to think of the language of free movement as being that of passing over a border, and that can be a very important, obviously, is an incredibly important thing as well. And there's a different kind of a border that's being enacted here, but I think what's important is that the freedom of movement is the freedom to be able to pass from one position, one state, to another in a manner of safety.
Yeah, then here becomes interesting that sort of what are the values in which people gather. So let's say, what are the values of the space in which one is entering? So what are the values of a club? Or what are the values of the institution? Or, and you know, like the terms that, you know, like inclusivity, or like a lot of things that we are discussing now, we didn't have to wait for Trump to be elected or for the politics to change direction. If you would watch on a dance floor 10 years ago, you would see that they're very often uncomfortable places for certain groups or genders or ethnicity or race. Or so in a way they do resonate, the values in which the clubs are placed. So, but how do you kind of reverse, how do you transform that? So what are the, because you know, entering a club is like entering somebody's house, you know the way how you're welcomed and treated will somehow be in line with the people who are somehow running this space. I really think that you can very fast sense where you are and how you are understood as an individual or a group by the way that you are welcome, by the sound system, by the program, by the treatment, by the lighting, etc. So Nadia, like, could we a little bit like go through the set of values that the club has and how these values resonate from technology that is being used to the way that people are treated from the end, etc., etc. So I think this is also where the answer comes, or experiencing something or crossing to another side, because it's a setup of different values around it as well. Yeah. Yeah.
ბასიანის პირველივე დღიდან ჩვენ მქონდა რომ სოლიდარობა, თავისუფლება, თანასწორობა არის ის ღირებულები, რომლის გარშემოც უნდა გავერთიანებულიყავით. თუმცა 5 წლის შემდეგ მე ვფიქრობ, რომ ეს სამივე ღირებულება, თუ არ არსებობს პასუხისგებლობა, ეს სამივე ღირებულება აზრს კარგავს, იმიტომ რომ ვფიქრობ, რომ პასუხისგებლობა არის ის ყველაზე დიდი ღირებულება, რომელიც ინტერპრეტაციებს არ ტოვებს, განსაკუთრებით თუ კი ვსაუბრობ თავისუფლებაზე. ამიტომ თუ როგორ უნდა შევიდეს სივრცეებში ამ ადამიანთან ის ღირებულება, რომელიც განცხადებულია კლუბს, რა თქმა უნდა, ეს არის ის რუტინული შრომა, რომელსაც საცეკვაო მოედანზე და საცეკვაო მოედნის გარეთ იმ ტექსტებში და იმ საკომუნიკაციო ენაში ვიყენებთ, რაც აქვს კლუბს.
Solidarity, freedom, and equality was the three main values on which the Club Bassiani was based from the very first day of when we started the club. And all the people united again around these three main values. But after 5 years, then this idea kind of transformed, and there is another addition to it: responsibility. Because we think that there is no every value and everything we do, it gains more. It loses place for no interpretations when you add the responsibility to it, because you are just responsible for everything you do. And the communication and everything which you do during this process is now based on these four values.
I mean, what's interesting in both cases, in Jazar Crew, but also in Bassiani, is that there is also the moment of visibility that you kind of gained. And this visibility also gives the visibility to the network, and especially in a creative field, like in case of Jazar Crew, the music. Tonight you're actually playing, and I mean, on that Kxema is like traveling all over the world, and so you also gave the visibility to those who are sort of part of these spaces, but also bringing the message further. So Roger, could you elaborate of what are the results from like the very beginning that you started till now? Like because the Jazar Crew is now, you are running your party as well in Berlin and etc. So Fusion Festival. I think it's interesting because you somehow, yeah, you gained a certain visibility, which comes also with responsibility that was mentioned. So just to, like, if you could elaborate on those, yeah.
results is, first of all, we as living inside the Israeli part in Haifa, we had like an identity crisis that we don't have our own nightclub. The studies all in Hebrew. The government is like deleting our history and language, and that we exist and making our own bar, and we have our own music, and you can order your drink in Arabic and you can find the community there. It is by itself like a resistance, that we exist there, that we are creating our own events, that you meet outside of university and outside of work in the public or in the club or in the parties, in the events, that the people meet each other, and all this is already a big result, what it's created. And visibility, that the people know that we exist, that there is actually Palestinian lives there, that we also have a party, that we also have music, we have our own culture, we have our own sound, and the visibility helped to share these things on the world, to meet people and to speak loud and to call for justice. And
I mean, there's also, as far as I remember, you also once spoke about how the music that you play is, you know, like you also use the certain samples from the Arab music and you combine it with electronic music, and this sound some of us heard, but most of us never heard because it's a new production. So there is also, again, this sort of use of music and art in delivering the message. So could you say something about that?
Yes, it's also, like I didn't start as a DJ, I started as a party organizer, and to each time make the party, sometimes I had to play it by myself. And by year after year, we started to create our own sound. People started to mix samples, music from Arabic, add electronic music. And especially in Ramallah, they have their own hip-hop style in the Arab world. And all the people there, they do like very special hip-hop. You can also check it out in the Boiler Room Palestine. And adding all the samples and all the sounds from the surround in the music, it's become its own genre and its own music.
Sound has started resonating through the world in a way, yeah. I mean, it's not a little thing, so I'm sort of asking you to say this because I think it's you know, like even if I remember the Fusion Festival and your stage, I mean, it had a very particular atmosphere that I haven't experienced in Germany or even in Berlin. So like there is a kind of space created for this sound. So we are here talking about, of course, the music industry somehow being influenced by what you're doing, but you're also setting up a new set of values and new names. And I think this is very important because, yeah, the visibility here plays an important role. Yeah, are there actually any questions? Because it would be kind of nice to... No, you're all fine. Okay, okay, okay. Is there any urgency going on? Yeah. No, I mean, it's interesting. I was like, I mean, there's the idea of creating political opposition through the dance floor, because at the time when I spoke about 90s, like if you think of Exit Festival, that some of you maybe know, but it's like one of the biggest music festivals in Serbia at the moment. It started as a student protest, and then from the streets it became a kind of music festival. It helped in harassment of Slobodan Milosevic, and now is the most commercial music industry festival, actually supported by government with a lot of sponsorships. So speaking of values, like how do you prevent that your space or space of what you do has this constant freshness, and is urgency something that will last? How long does this dance of urgency last in a way? So maybe Roger question for you. Yeah, in a sense, how, like, what's the end of an urgency? Like what was the ideal situation? But also, how do you prevent that you sort of maybe
like
it's actually,
we as Palestinian who lives again in Haifa, we are having a problem to solve with the state of Israel and the occupation, and we have also with our own cultures. There's some conservative, and it's something very new to go party, dance, alcohol, club, music. So we are in between our people and in the government. So that's why it's kind of like alternative spaces, or let's call it like an underground.
How do people react to what you're doing? You know, like do you notice that the crowd is growing, or the movement is spreading, or are there difficulties about maintaining what you're doing here?
It's like different between like the whole. It's all alternative. There's different between the kind of the alternative. There's techno parties. There's like reggae parties. There's a normal night, just like alternative spaces. People reacting. They like it, and it's new to it. A lot of promoters and organizers came out from this and started to make their own parties, and I would say that it's still developing. It's still new, and people still doing this.
Nadia, Georgi, what's the situation in Georgia after revolution?
ზოგადად რევოლუციებს მოსდევს ხოლმე ნიჰილიზმი, რომელიც გარკვეული დრო გრძელდება და თბილისის შემთხვევაშიც ასე არის. თბილისის კონკრეტულად ბასიანისთვისაც ეს ნიჰილიზმი გადამდები იყო, თუმცა ნიჰილიზმი კარგია იმისთვის, რომ დაინახო იმედი და დღეს კაფეოთ ხედავთ თუ საით უნდა წავიდეთ, რისთვის უნდა მიბრძოლოთ, რისთვის უნდა გავერთიანდეთ და ჩემთვის ცეკვა მართლა ჭეშმარიტია და როგორც ფილმში არის, თუ კიდევ ერთხელ იქნება ეს ჭეშმარიტი ცეკვა, რომელიც კიდევ ერთ რევოლუციას მოიტანს.
After the revolution, a general revolution brings in nihilism, and it was the same in case of us. After the revolution, there was a big period of nihilism in Georgia, and this nihilism was spreading and spreading and spreading. But then finally we went to a point where some hopes came, and as we already say in the film, which is called Dance or Die, we see this hope, and because we believe that if the dance is true, then it brings revolution.
And what's I mean, I kind of know actually the answer, but you just mentioned before that you changed the visual language and you started going more into direction of, because in a way, in a country where cultural institutions failed, you kind of as a club took this role. So now what's the next step? Like, how do you curate the crowd further, or how do you provide the crowd next level? So, or what is the new content that you are interested in bringing here?
ძალიან რთულია, როცა მუშაობ, როცა გიწევს იმ მიმართულებით, რასაც საზღვაო მოედანი ქვია, იმიტომ რომ იმის გარდა რომ იცვლება სტრატეგიები, იცვლება პუბლიკაც, რომელსაც შენ თუ რაღაც რუტინულ შრომას ჩადებ ამ ადამიანებზე, რა თქმა უნდა იმათ გაქვთ გარეთ მზის შუქზე, მაგრამ შენ კიდევ ახრიდან გიწევს ახალ პუბლიკასთან მუშაობა. მე ძალიან ბევრს ვფიქრობ, რომ ცოდინის გაზიარება არის ერთ-ერთი ყველაზე მნიშვნელოვანი რამ, რაც საზღვაო მოედანზე უნდა ხდებოდეს. ეს ხდება სტრატეგიის, ყოველგვარი ტაქტიკების გარშე და ახლა დრო არის ვფიქრობ, რომ ეს სივრცეები გამოვიყენოთ განათლებისთვის. რა თქმა უნდა, ვიღაცისთვის რაღაცის სწავლა ძალიან დიდი პრეტენზია არის რომ რაღაცა ასწავლო, მაგრამ ის რომ ჩვენ ერთმანეთს ის დაგროვილი გამოცდილება გავუზიაროთ, ვფიქრობ რომ ყველაზე საუკეთესო ადგილი არის საცეკვაო მოედნები.
It's really hard to create the crowd on and dance floor of a club because there are so many people and all the effort which you put into creating this crowd. From years to years, this crowd is changing. So the people which you already worked with are at some point leaving the club, and then they bring their experience outside in the city, and then new people are coming in. So you start over and over and over again. Right now we are at the point where we think that the main thing is to share the knowledge. And of course it's really big responsibility and very pretentious statement to say that you are an educator or like this, but the good thing is and the more proper thing is to share the knowledge. So the knowledge which we have, you share with some dancers, and they bring their own knowledge, and this knowledge which we share with each other is the main thing which now brings our crowd together.
Yeah, bringing the knowledge, but also extracting the knowledge from what you did successfully, in a way. I think this is the point where I can connect, and this is the point where different universities also shared an interest because you did something that in some places is maybe not possible. And I would actually like to, Kilina, now bring here the topic of in order for body to move, you need a certain conditions, but sometimes the bodies are very numb because, so in a way, we do still, the clubbing or like clubs still do exist. So somehow I have this idea that the clubs are almost like a formalin for a collective body, like they can be a way for practicing of people to be together. And that in the time of crisis, this body can come out. So they're like different agendas of different places. But I'm thinking in terms of like when body is not able to move or when it gets numb. So this sort of impossibility for even imagining the movement. So this is also what inspired my project was, yes, of course, love for clubbing, but also realizing that most of people on a dance floor just stand instead of take the space, express themselves, dare to connect. So I think, and I don't know how you feel, but I think we very often witness dance floors where people don't move that much. So this numbness is something that should also be acknowledged, I think. Like, would you like to elaborate?
Yeah, definitely. I think there are a few things in that are really important. One is, and I was thinking about this earlier when we were speaking about these notions of transformation and border passing and such, that I think one of the things that happens not just in a dance club but in a dance situation is a particular sort of manifestation or use or a particular kind of decision as to how one expends one's energy. And that in a regime of sort of overwork, hyper, neoliberal control, et cetera, when we all kind of work to the bone, and it's an era of precarity, an era in which there's a sort of general state of tension, there can be a sense of, and in a way, this is what we really get with industrial modernity, is the sense that work has to be used for efficiency, and it can't be used for play, something useless. And in fact, a lot of, with material on dance manias in the 19th century, a lot of the accusations, including among ghost dancers, among the Native American ghost dancers, was that they were wasting their energy and that they should to dance rather than get a good night's sleep so that they could sort of be productive. And some of the government agents were saying you should, teach them the dollar, and so that they'll kind of like learn capitalism and they'll do away with their Indian ways, So there's definitely a club culture, definitely operates simultaneously within an economy, and also it operates sort of counter to a particular sort of economy. So, I think that there's something around these notions of how do you pass, or what's the passage from if there's a certain sort of state of numbness, either emotional numbness or that translates into physical numbness, mental fatigue that translates into physical fatigue and vice versa, how to pass from that into something that is a kind of an enabling and an energizing. And again, with the Native American ghost dancers, what they said is, we'd rather die like men than like starved rats. And so we're going to dance to the point of exhaustion. We're going to kind of dance past, and that is going to call up a new energy. I do think that there's something further with that connects a little bit with this and with the question you were posing, and that has to do really with the notion of ecstasy or of the ecstatic. And I think that a lot of what these moments of dancing together can do, and it's not just in dancing, but it's sort of heightened in that, is that ecstatic, that standing outside, that is a reaching sort of past a self and towards others, and that can be experienced in all kinds of different ways. And I think that not only sort of allows for a kind of a really radical passage beyond a sort of debilitating individuation, etc., but also it's what serves as the ground and also the possibility of another sort of mode. I haven't quite, I'm kind of skirting around, or I'm thinking through the question that you're asking, because what I want to think really, and this is a term besides the notion of ecstasis or of ecstasy, of sort of the standing outside, or ecstasy, belonging, a notion of kind of one stands outside in order to kind of be with others in a way to reconfigure. So the notions of society we're accustomed to have to do with the idea that they're individuals, and then individuals get together, and that creates a collective. And so how do you get a bunch of individuals together, right? So that seems to be the sort of constant, battle, is like society, how do you gather individuals, right? But that is based on a model of individuation, of sort of social. Whereas if you take a model, or if you understand the ecstatic, this kind of way in which we're constantly passing beyond or outside, or that in those connections, there's something else, and it's a very tangible or intangible experience. You've got a completely different sense of understanding as to what is the basic place, and that connects on an ecological level with the sense of sort of being in a place, with being in a time. There are all kinds of ways in which there's a sort of passage beyond self. And I think that with that is also a notion of ascesis, or of exercise or training or practice. And I think that one of the ways that we can understand sort of how do you pass beyond numbness, or beyond that sort of the zombie capitalism, or zombie, whatever zombies, I mean, zombies are often associated with capital, but it doesn't have to be capital only. Whatever is that state that's kind of going to rid the vital life, that on some level, that I think even these very small, tender, I mean, some of what Rajay was talking about in terms of these very small events, or even this notion of hosting, it doesn't begin necessarily with the crowd. It begins with a kind of 1 + 1 + 2, or with something that's very intimate and vulnerable. And I think recovering those vulnerabilities is what really allows movement, or is a kind of movement outside of passing beyond a numbness. And then if it gathers momentum and there's a larger group, that's where you get that completely different quality that you're talking about. Otherwise, you've just got a bunch of, egos in a kind of, pen hanging out, and it, absolutely destructive to any sort of deep solidarity.
Yeah, you touched on a lot. So yeah, dropping the ego at the wardrobe is something that I would always prefer in clubs. And I think some clubs are really actually for the pump up of the ego, and some are for forgetting about it. But there is also this difference of the terms from 90s and now. So let's say when we go out in 90s, you would say we are trancing, or one is in a trance, but now we would say that one is wasting his or her time, which was connected. Then there was also this moment of, dancing till death, as a kind of heroic almost a gesture. But then there is also this combination with the dance floors, is that it's always a combination of eros and thanatos somehow. The dance floors are often connected to a sexual expression, liberation, but also there is also this dark side of it. So that's somehow announcing a part of the video that I would actually like to show, the politics of ecstasy, that was produced by Chiara Baldini, a researcher, and Rafael Cosdron. And what's interesting about this is that basically Chiara is interested in bacchanalias and Dionysian rituals, and the law that prohibits bacchanalias is actually in Vienna in a Kunsthistorisches Museum, and the language that is used in that law is exactly how Bassiani has been attacked by the government. It's exactly the language that is always used to prohibit any kind of underground scene or subculture. So it's sort of interesting because we're talking about bacchanalias and the same language still applies today. But also what here I would like to show you is this moment of inclusivity and kind of safe spaces and transformation through the state of trance and participation. So I will play you a short part of the politics of ecstasy.
It is late at night in ancient Rome. Small groups of people holding torches are silently walking in the streets of the capital of the empire. There are blossoming young women and experienced matrons, free men and slaves, citizens of Rome and immigrants, mostly simple people from lower classes, but also some courageous members of the elite. They disappear behind the doors of private houses. Once they have all arrived, the high priestess starts with a powerful invocation, calling the god of ecstasy to join his followers. Purifications are performed, and the sacred drink is shared among new initiates and veterans of the cult. Then the music starts. The sound builds up, louder and louder. People start dancing, letting themselves be moved by the music. Faster and faster, allowing sounds to flow out of their bodies. Someone starts screaming long and loud, followed by many others. The cries are so wild that they don't even seem human anymore, more like animals. And as the night grows darker and deeper, the sound of enthusiasm gives way to that of pleasure. Powerful release, deep liberation, ecstasy, nature taking possession of the body, breaking the barriers of conventions and social rules. The healing power of pleasure weaves its magic among the bodies and souls of the many as they become one. At the break of dawn, the music wanes to silence, and the gods recede, like shadows, to make space for humans. The bodies rediscover their limits as they stumble back into the street, shading their eyes from the sun, holding each other from falling, exhausted, happy, reborn.
So yeah, that's actually an interesting introduction into the dance floor for those who will participate tonight. But yeah, I mean the points here. Yeah, okay, we are actually really. There's inclusivity mentioned. There is a state of trance. There is a ritual going on. There is transformation that maybe doesn't look exactly as the society is expecting from us. So it's about letting go. It's about trying another self. Masking, maybe being in a drag. So what is interesting here is this role. The patriarchy is always attacked or provoked by these kind of gatherings, and I think this is what, especially in case of Nadia and Georgi, is also like a kind of this idea of how one should look and behave like. And anyway, I was just like, maybe, are there any questions? Because actually we're already touching the end of the panel, so.
Yeah, I mean, I really like both of your initiatives with creating these kind of common dance floors where everybody can come and be. And it made me think about commons in general, this idea of things that belong to everyone. And then in this context of the commons, I kind of started to ask myself, or I always find it a big question, how do we protect the commons, or how far do we go to protect the commons? And so I wanted, I mean, to get back to the dance floor, my question is kind of how do you protect, or what is your experience, how far do you have to go to protect this common ground that you created? Do you maybe also have a principle about that, or is your experience that it's already enough to just hand over the responsibility to everybody involved to hold up these values that you created?
Is the question for everybody, or?
Of course, yeah, or everybody on the panel, but
yeah.
I was directing it to them, but maybe also somebody else has something to say.
No, I think this is a very much question for for Nadia.
ზუსტად ამიტომ საუბრობდი პასუხისგებლობაზე, რომ თავარია, რომ ეს ღირებულება შევიდეს, იმიტომ რომ როდესაც კლუბში მოსვლა ადამიანს აქვს პასუხისგებლობა, ის პასუხისგებლობას იღებს, რომ იზრუნოს სხვა ადამიანებზე, დაიცვას ის ღირებულებები, რომელიც გააჩნიათ, დაიცვას, იყოს თანასწორად შეხედოს მის გვერდით მოცეკვას, ამიტომ თავისუფლებას როცა საუბრობ, ხო, თავისუფლება ძალიან ბევრი ინტერპრეტაციაა, თავისუფლებამ საციკო მოიტანზე ცოტა მეტი ქაოსი მოიტანა. ამიტომ პასუხისგებლობა როგორც ღირებულება შევა საციკო მოიტანზე, ის არის მთავარი მცველი იმ ღირებულებების, რაც გვაქვს.
That's why I was talking about the responsibility, because when you go on the dance floor and you become responsible for the people who are dancing, become responsible for each other, to take care of each other, to take care of each other's values. Because, okay, you have the freedom on the dance floor, you have the freedom of expression, but this freedom is nothing without this responsibility, because just freedom brought a little bit chaos on the dance floor. And when there is a responsibility added to this freedom, then it brings the protection of the shared values and what you call the commons.
Answering a little bit, Roger? I guess the question would be, how do you create environment in which one takes the responsibility for his or her action, but also protect that environment so that it's not only protected by the club owners, but also by the community itself somehow? Is that like a sum up? I'm just trying to sum it up, yeah. And also, what is the difficulty of keeping the space safe space, or the space in which this can apply?
like people normally take care of each other in our culture, in the city, in the dance floor, or in the street. They are warm people. They talk to each other. They, even if somebody walk in the street with some heavy things, somebody come and help him. So the same thing in the nightclub. If somebody feel dizzy, yesterday I was in a party, I saw like a girl was a little bit drunk, and few people went there, gave her water, took her to the side. Girls went with her to the toilet. So the people themselves, they take care of each other first of all. And some of the clubs, unfortunately, they don't have like an awareness crew. I don't know if I'm answering the right thing, but I've been in parties, not in Palestine, but for example in Berlin, that there is awareness crew that always inside the party, that they take care of all these things. They don't care about anything else other than harassments or fights or some things like this. And the people themselves, if they participate in the party, like some of them, they feel part from the party, from the community, then it's adding this thing for on the dance floor. They feel very much part of the party.
Okay, any other questions?
Yeah, you mentioned some territories. Sorry, my voice is awful. Some territories such as Tbilisi, Palestine, and I think in your exhibition you had also Kyiv in Ukraine. I don't know if you mentioned it during the talk.
Yeah.
I was like outside sometimes. But can you maybe tell us why you choose Kyiv as a city? Because there are these famous parties called Cxema, which looks like very interesting in terms of how people react in this crowd and during this party. So can you maybe and maybe you also, if you already been to Kyiv, can you tell us how you experienced this city?
Yeah, I mean, that's what I mentioned, that there's a lot of writing going on, or like, you know, Vice promoting, or everybody writing reports. But for me, it was important to feel the space, because the whole point of clubbing for me is to actually stay in touch with my body as a very sensory. So when I enter the environment, that I trust what I feel instead of doubt it. And another thing is to actually avoid the numbness that I did recognize. So just to connect a little bit with numbness now here is also sort of interesting that, you know, no phones on a dance floor or no photos on a dance floor. This whole kind of resistance to technology was also introduced because people are not able to connect on a dance floor. They keep the technology in front of them and bodies. So these spaces became just very annoying to me, and then I started like looking around. And for example, in Cxema, it's again a very particular situation. It's basically, this party started in 2014, so after the political urgency, and the idea was to really find the spaces that nobody cares of and bring the youth to kind of keep them together instead of that they get dissolved into pieces. So it's also something maybe about caring of each other by figuring out these concepts. And if somebody didn't figure out this club industria for me when I was 16, maybe today things would be different for me or something. So like, I think here we're really talking about particular choices and interdisciplinary collaborations between artists with these people who maybe have an experience or not in choreographing and designing these spaces. And in Ukraine it was interesting, there was a festival called Plan B on a border with Russia in Kharkov, I believe, and they were really called a festival for creating a political opposition. So kind of offering alternative to the politics that are being promoted there. And then this is often seen as an underground sort of, because it does come from underneath and tries to go outside. And yeah, there are plenty more, like if you think of Mina from Lisboa. I mean, when the project started, this was really like me trying to tell the story about my memories of 90s. This is how most of people remember it. But by the time I actually started doing a project, I met so many people who do things similar. Like if you go to Sao Paulo, there are posters saying, when you feel pain, keep on dancing. So we are talking that dance is not only something that is understood as a joy and entertainment and a bunch of happy people dancing together. Dance has transitions, is touching the bottom and rising again. It's exactly as described here. It's becoming an animal. It's becoming something else. It's becoming genderless. It's becoming abstract. Those practices then sort of resonate to the others in a way. So yeah, I mean, there's like plenty to, even if you think of like clubs this hall in Amsterdam or Red Light Radio, I mean, these were bodies that are opposition to what was dominating the public space, in which not everybody felt comfortable, or clubs that, so out of this comfort, these kind of forms are being created. And yeah, I don't know if I answer. I think it's also important to difference music festivals. There is a bunch of music festivals now, the carnivals all over the place. But what is the value of these spaces? Like, you know, like if you think of Boom Festival that doesn't have a corporative promotion, that is able to provide safe space for people, that are 70,000 people tripping on LSD and it feels nice. Good luck to do that in a club in a city. So, you know, like there is really a lot of things to extract from these subcultures and how they actually grew, and what it means to, yeah, how does this resonate further. So, but now when we're here...
I will add something about Kyiv. ყველაზე მნიშვნელოვანი კიევის საკლუბო სცენამ გადაარჩინა ის ახალგაზრდები, რაც უკრაინაში პოლიტიკურ კრიზისს მოყვა და პრინციპში, როცა საუბრობთ საცეკვაო მოედნის ძალაზე, საკლუბო კულტურის, უნდა გავიხსენოთ, რომ თუნდაც თბილისი გარშემორტყმული არის კონფლიქტური რეგიონებით, სადაც თბილისის საცეკვაო მოედანზე დაიწყეს ცეკვა ერთად რუსებმა, უკრაინელებმა, სომხებმა, აზერბაიჯანელებმა, ირანელებმა, თურქებმა, რომლებიც ერთმანეთში თითქმის ყველას აქვს კონფლიქტი, აქ დამეგობრდნენ და შემდეგ უკვე ეს დამეგობრება უკვე გადავიდა უკვე ზიშუქზეც გავიდა. ზუსტად ამიტომ აქვს უდიდესი მნიშვნელობა საცეკვაო მოედნებს.
Speaking of the dance floor of Kyiv, actually these clubs were the spaces which saved the youth of Ukraine during the political crisis. And if we are speaking about the power of the dance floor, and if you take the example of Tbilisi, the Georgia and Tbilisi is surrounded by the many conflict regions like the Russians, the Armenians, the Azerbaijan, Turks, Iranian people, the people from Ukraine. So all of our neighbors have the conflict, the war with each other. And from year to year, these people started dancing to Tbilisi, and the people like, for example, from Armenia, Azerbaijan, and from all these countries, were coming to Tbilisi and they were dancing together, and they, from years to years, they started like making friends with each other. And then when they came back to their countries, this experience of dancing with a representative of a country who has a war with your country, so kind of dancing with the enemies, so-called enemies. Yeah, this experience were brought to their countries, and it's reflected on their like daily experience.
Yeah, actually important point, because the Bassiani became something to look at in the region, because for a lot of people traveling to Berlin, which like is always, of course, introduced in the context of clubbing, is not possible because of visa and because of the costs. So the movement somehow, let's say something that maybe is very Berlin related, somehow through the Tbilisi actually now started resonating further, yeah. And but you mentioned also fighting, dancing with an enemy, which actually does come in a connection to the martial dance as well. I would just like to bring back to Kelina one more question, because I remember when I read about dancing marathons in 20s and 30s, there was this newspaper's article that says that, so I don't know if everybody knows, but basically there were these massive competitions of people that would dance forever till the drop down, basically, and people could bet on them who's the couple that's going to last long. And this is not an invention. This was really taking place in 20s and 30s, and it was a kind of connected somehow, for me at least, to the reality shows and this joy of watching other people suffering, which actually also in performance art often comes back as well. But there was an article in newspapers at that time that says that America is dancing itself towards a war. So these massive dances were actually a sign of society or country actually entering possible war. So I'm just curious, because we are now living in times where thousands of music festivals are happening, while at the same time there's so many issues that we are dealing. So I'm just trying to see, like, could also these dances sometimes be an announcement of a possible conflict in large, or something actually being to worry about?
Yeah, so the dance manias are really interesting because they were taking place in during the Depression. So it was sort of in the lead up to war, but it was also in the aftermath of war. It was in the interwar, and it was during a period of mass unemployment, a lot of poverty. So people sort of having nothing to do, but also a kind of a crisis in that sense. So I think that in a way, what all of this shows, it's not necessarily that it would sort of forecast war as such, but it does, I think, tap into a kind of sense of urgency, of malaise, of a sort of need for care, but also a kind of a crisis with regard to expenditure of time and all of this. And so I think that there is a sort of these intense periods of dancing or of gathering. I think there's always a sense of being within a moment of some sort of seismic shifting taking place, and it can be that erupts in war or comes from the aftermath of war, or is taking. I mean, on some level, one could say we've been in this extended state of exception. So if the club is a kind of a state, a suspended state, that is a suspension within what is a state of exception. So we are kind of in cultural war. We're kind of in. We're in crisis. So I think it's not surprising, and whether that erupts, or whether there's a way in which maybe some of these sort of bonds and other alternative ecologies and alternative economies can take place to sort of shift or assuage something. I think maybe that's something that we can take as a really maybe positive challenge to protect and to care for.
If there are no any more questions, we would close here. Yeah, no more questions. Okay, so yeah, I actually hope that you will now, or maybe you actually already understood the dances as like this, but maybe you will see the dance floor now differently. And the question of why one dance for, or what is your dance about, is something that's nice to ask ourselves or your friends, or and just to bring back to the I dance alone and we dance together, which became a slogan in Georgia. So this I and we is something that is constantly transitioning. So if you would think 20 years ago or 10 years ago, you would have promotion of Nike saying, yes, you can do it, but now it's suddenly all we. So I think it also shows the time in which we live. So we are now definitely dancing together instead of alone. And yeah, I would love to thank for invitation and for giving a floor to this research and community that came out of it. There's many more of us. To also support from Q21 in Vienna and everybody who recognized this urgency. And yeah, thank you for attention. Yeah, thank you everybody. Yeah, thank you.